I just wanted to go over some of these questions for you and, explain what the perfect answers were so that you can make your corrections on your reflection. Once again, during this video, if there are questions that you did not have and you'd like to skip to the other questions, that's fine with me. But just make sure that you're, listening to the full extent of what I'm saying. And if you still are confused about what the perfect answer would be and what you should put in your reflections, just reach out to me via email. All right, the first one I want to go over is why do many historians classify the Ghana Empire as an enigma or a challenging code to break? Essentially, why is it hard to learn about? Well, the Ghana Empire, unfortunately, we've lost many of their achievements. And a lot of this has to do with a few things. And there were some things I wanted you to touch on. First of all, I wanted you to talk about how historically the Ghana Empire is taught using the oral tradition or the history that is passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation, essentially storytelling. Now, the problem with that is since nothing was written down because we don't have evidence of a written language, that means that there isn't any primary sources. And whenever we learn about different empires, throughout the world, that's what we heavily rely on. So if you think about ancient Egypt, we had their hieroglyphics. So we use their hieroglyphics, and that's how we can draw conclusions about what it is that, their achievements were and how their society worked. The only primary sources that we do have are primary sources from traders who were part of that gold trade in Ghana, and most of these were Arab traders coming from the Muslim world. So there isn't a lot, especially because there wasn't as much travel from West Africa to more of the Middle East, but that is going to increase as time goes on, especially with the spread of Islam, which you guys will be learning about later this week. All right, the second question, how was the next leader of the Ghana Empire determined? Well, just first and foremost to establish this, they were a monarchy, they were led by a royal family, and they used a process called matrilineal descent. And essentially what that means is they refer to their king as the Ghana, and the next Ghana would be chosen not from the firstborn son of the king or the Ghana, but actually from their closest female family member. So that was normally a sister. So whichever sister was oldest and closest to the king, their next born male would become the next Ghana. Now, this is a very good idea, and was actually somewhat revolutionary because we didn't see this elsewhere. Because I want you guys to think about any place we've learned about, there would be good rulers and then bad rulers, and it kind of seemed to go in a cycle. Well, in Ghana, what doing this did was it made it so that whoever was next in line wasn't raised by the king, right? They weren't entitled. They had to go out there, and even though they were still part of the royal family, they were, wealthier. It wasn't just like they were brought up with everything handed to them, having unlimited power underneath a king. It was something more in the lines of they were brought up in a somewhat more normal family than you would be if you were directly the king's child. All right, so it added, slightly different families into the rule by, let's say it's the sisters by their husband. So it just added a little bit more diversity to the royal court and made it so that new rulers would come up with different ideas and they weren't as attached to the way the previous king was thinking. So it led to better government overall. All right, the trade industry. The things that I wanted in this is I wanted you guys to explicitly say what the primary goods were. So you needed to talk about how the gold and the salt trade. I wanted to see those words gold and salt. And I wanted you to include that Ghana was the ones who had a lot of gold and they traded for salt. If you wanted to add in details about why they needed salt, that was fine, but also was not necessary. And then the second part, why was it so profitable? You had to talk about how the Ghana Empire heavily taxed the traders. So that led their economy to having a lot of wealth. And since people wanted the gold so bad, they were willing to pay the taxes. And in a lot of cases, when the gold was brought back to whatever civilization traded it, the taxes were more than paid for. So it was completely worth it for the traders. All right, question 4. In Ghana, salt was worth its weight in gold, meaning if you were to buy 1 pound of salt, it would cost 1 pound of gold. Why would the people of Ghana put such a high value on salt? So essentially, salt is something that we actually need as humans to survive. It's something that you might not always think about. It's not as crucial as water, so to speak, but it is something that you need, or else you will have deficits um, in your blood levels and different things that we have to survive. So the thing is that they absolutely needed it, and that was a fundamental point that you needed to touch on. Now, one thing that to think about is, yeah, it's not as valuable as water, maybe. Salt, you don't need it as much as you'd need water. But the fact of the matter is, if you didn't have any water, you would trade however much gold you'd want in the world to get the water so you could survive. So it's kind of a similar idea that, survival is the most important thing. Even though gold is a luxury item, it's not a luxury if you don't have what you need to survive. Also, salt is before refrigerators were created, was the way that you would preserve food. So if you, for example, if you lived in the Ghana Empire, you caught a fish and you didn't want to eat that fish that day, the only way to preserve it was to completely coat it in salt, and that would keep it still edible days later. Um, and essentially, they had such a surplus of gold. This is the last point, that it wasn't as valuable in Ghana as it would be in other places because they had so much of it. There were stories that they would even dress dogs and animals in gold. Because they had so much of it. The government even needed to control the supply of gold so that it wouldn't lose its value. All right, last one. How is the social structure of Ghana set up, and why is it somewhat unique? All right, so the first part of this question you need to answer was basically that they had a normal social structure. Okay, they had a royal family, they had nobles, they had peasants, they had enslaved people. And that part, I was hoping that you would list that out and include that in your answer. Now, the unique part, why is it somewhat unique? Think middle tiers. This was something I detailed in the PowerPoint. Now, what's interesting compared to other places we've learned, to be considered a noble, you didn't necessarily need to own land. You could have a good job, you could have a good connection with the government, with the royal family, and that could make you a noble, even if you didn't own land. The other thing was that peasants could actually be landowners. They just weren't as wealthy or have as much prestige as a noble would or a royal would. They could still own land. And they also were given the right to trial. Now, if you compare this, to what was going on in Europe at the time in the Middle Ages, in Europe, they would never even think about hearing a trial from someone who was considered a peasant. In Ghana, it was much different. Okay, in Ghana, the Ghana or the king would actually listen to any complaints that came in, you know, through the government. They would bring the people into the king's court or the Ghana's court, and they would hear both sides of the argument, and then the Ghana would make a judgment on it. So a lot more equity and treatment under the law than when you compare it to Europe or to Persia or to China, in Ghana, which was very revolutionary and something very unique at the time period. So essentially, peasants weren't treated as poorly as they were elsewhere. All right, guys, if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me. I hope this video was helpful, and I look forward to reading your reflections.